The Cold War was a 20th century conflict between the United States of America, the US, and the Soviet Union, the USSR, and their respective allies over political, economic, and military issues, often described as a struggle between capitalism and communism. But the issues were actually far greater than that. In Europe, this meant the US led West and NATO on one side, and Soviet led East and the Warsaw Pact on the other. The Cold War lasted from 1945 to the collapse of the USSR in 1991. The term was first used by the English writer George Orwell in an article published in 1945 to refer to what he predicted would be a nuclear stalemate between two or three monstrous superstates, each possessed of a weapon by which millions of people can be wiped out in a few seconds. But why Cold War? The war was cold because there was never a direct military engagement between the two leaders, the US and the USSR, although shots were exchanged in the air during the Korean War. There were plenty of proxy wars around the world as states supported by either side fought, but in terms of the two leaders and in terms of Europe, the two never fought in a regular war. Let's move on to the origins of the Cold War. Explanations for the onset of the Cold War must begin with World War II, a conflict that ranks by any conceivable measure as the most destructive in human history. World War II brought unparalleled levels of death, devastation, privation, and disorder. By unhinging the world of stable politics, inherited wisdom, traditions, institutions, alliances, royalties, commerce, and classes, the war created the conditions that made great power conflict highly likely, if not inevitable. The aftermath of World War II left the United States and Russia as the dominant military powers in the world, but they had very different forms of government and economy. The former a capitalist democracy, and the latter a communist dictatorship. The two nations were rivals that feared each other, each ideologically opposed. The war also left Russia in control of large areas of Eastern Europe, and the US-led allies in control of the West. While the Allies restored democracy in their regions, Russia began making Soviet satellites out of its liberated lands. The split between the two was dubbed the Iron Curtain. In reality, there had been no liberation, just a few conquests by the USSR. The West feared a communist invasion, physical and ideological, that would turn them into communist states with a Stalin-style leader, the worst possible option, and for many it caused fear over the likelihood of mainstream socialism too. The US countered with Truman Doctrine, with its policy of containment to stop communism spreading. It's also turned the world into a giant map of allies and enemies, with the US pledging to prevent the communists from extending their power, a process that led to the West supporting some terrible regimes. The US also offered the Marshall Plan, massive aid package aimed at supporting collapsing economies that were letting communist sympathizers gain power. Military alliances were formed as the West grouped together as NATO and the East banded together as the Warsaw Pact. By 1951, Europe was divided into two power blocs, American-led and Soviet-led, each with atomic weapons. A Cold War followed, spreading globally and leading to a nuclear standoff. So how was the Cold War in Europe? At the end of the Second World War, Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation under the control of the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, although located within the Soviet zone, was also split amongst 4 powers. The American, British, and French sectors would form West Berlin, and the Soviet sector became the East Berlin. The relationship between the former wartime allies, although tense from as early as 1942, became increasingly strained as they struggled to reach agreement on the shape of the post-war Europe. By 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union had begun to emerge as ideologically opposed. Ironically, this actually turned into hot war in Asia. Asia became the second major theater of the Cold War, and the place where the Cold War first turned hot. Europe, of course, generated more controversy and received far more attention from the United States and the Soviet Union, emerging as the principal focus of tensions between the former allies and the immediate aftermath of the World War I. It can be said that when two superpowers confront each other, the world dramatically changes. Therefore, Asia is also difficult to avoid this. In Northeast Asia, the Korean War from 1950 to 1953 occurred, with South Korea being supported by the US and other Western countries, and North Korea being aided by China and the Soviet Union. As a result, on July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed. In Southeast Asia, two typical wars took place. The first one was historical Indochina War of French colonialists. China, the Soviet Union, and the countries that supported and provided aid to Vietnam's resistance wars, and the result was the Geneva Agreement was signed in 1954, and the War of Vietnamese goods by the U.S. imperialists from 1954 to 1975. The U.S. entered the new strategic battlefield of the people in Vietnam, including 4 wars, and the Vietnamese people fought against the U.S. with the